Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Off the Cushion podcast. I'm Sampur Varzana, and with me is Dwayne Rester. How are you, Dwayne?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks, Tom.
Great. Thank you for being here and welcome, everyone. We have an exciting topic for this second episode of the podcast. We're going to talk about the three Dharma seals, which are important concepts to understand when delving deeper into meditation practice, particularly from a Buddhist or Chan perspective. But I should caveat that if you're hearing about them for the first time, they may sound on first glance super philosophical or Buddhisty, but actually they're just helpful descriptors for the nature of reality, as we'll see. So, Dwayne, do you want to kick us off with some thoughts about the three Dharma seals?
I will, and I've actually written something down, only a couple of pages, and it's nowhere near as far as you would go. As you'll understand as we go through this, it is really the entirety of you're practicing as a Buddhist, or you're practicing in some other way. So here we go. What are the Dharma seals? Um, the the first three teachings that the Buddha gave upon awakening became known as the Dharma seals. They're also they're a signifier of what's an authentic doctrine from a Buddhist standpoint. They're also, you may have heard them called the three marks of existence. But again, like I say, it was the first teaching after the Buddha's awakening. He had 5 people that he had practiced with, and then he came out and gave this teaching. What are these 3 marks of existence, these 3 Dharma seals? They are impermanence, not self, and suffering. The 3 Dharma seals are used as standards to determine whether or not a sutra or a doctrine is valid. If it meets these 3 standards, it is a valid Buddhist teaching. Although we will not always directly word it as such, saying, now
Right.
I'm going to talk about not suffering. Our conversations will almost entirely be based on these descriptors, these ideas. These concepts are in our mind because not only, to keep these concepts in our mind, it becomes not only a litmus test of our practice, but also through observation of our own minds, they become the path itself.
Hmm.
Looking at these things. So what is suffering? How to recognize suffering? Suffering comes from existence itself. Suffering, also known as dukkha. Other words are unsatisfactoriness, uneasiness. Suffering or dissatisfaction is among the most misunderstood ideas of Buddhism. It seems kind of nihilistic. Life is dukkha, the Buddha said, but he didn't mean it that it is all unhappiness and disappointment. Rather, he meant that ultimately it cannot satisfy.
Hmm.
Even when things do satisfy, a pleasant time with friends, a wonderful meal, a new car, a new house, the satisfaction doesn't last because all of these things are impermanent. They're not of their own. They're empty of any separate identity. So these things change. So how do we recognize our own dis-ease, to use a term that John Kabat-Zinn used? I always like this. Instead of disease, it's
Hmm.
dis-ease.
Sure.
Buddhism talks about the 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance, or you could call greed, aversion, and ignorance. Basically, we want more of what we crave and less of the things that bother us. In other words, we want things to be different than they are. Ignorance means that this dissatisfaction is because we want more of this and less of that. We have certain expectations. We're actually creating our own discontent. We're
Hmm.
actually creating our own dissatisfaction.
That's right.
We are the masters of our own lives, yet guess who gets in our way? We do. So let's go into the other ones, the ones that kind of are the gateway or the hinge, as Guagu would call it, to dissatisfaction, also towards liberation. Impermanence, the other word for that is anicca, means that nothing is lasting or fixed. Everything is temporary and changing. It's not so much a word or a noun, it's mostly like a verb. It's an experience. Although these things change, the change might happen slowly, change is happening. We suffer because we want or expect things to be predictable, certain, solid like a rock. Yet all things are transient. All things are uncertain. Things are changing moment to moment all the time. Nothing stays the same. Everything is fluid and ever changing. You could call it new beginnings, or every moment is fresh, is a more positive way to look at it. You could see impermanence as something that is negative. However, impermanence is actually, again, it's like a new beginning, freshness that is ever changing. If we're in a bad situation, it's going to change. We suffer because we want things to be certain. We want to know that things will always be there and that they don't change. So how do we practice to understand impermanence? Here are some ways. Again, we'll go into hours and days worth of detail later, but
Of course.
the practice and understanding of impermanence is not just another description of reality, but it can be a tool that helps us transform our healing towards our liberation. As an example, if you look at most recent emotion, perhaps you were very excited about something, perhaps you were very angry about something that happened. Now that event is occurred and it's over. But what happened to that emotion? Are you still excited? Are you
Right.
still angry? Well, only through memory would you be. So it's not a reality. It's a thought that has come and has passed. So if we recognize those moments, those flow in between emotions and between states of emotion, states of feelings, you'll recognize the natural state of our minds. Our mind is not always angry. It's not always excited. It's not always feeling in pain. These things come and they go. But in between those, that's the natural state of our mind. That's where our freedom lies. This natural state of mind is free of any fixed point. If our fixed mind was always on one point, we couldn't possibly have another thought or another thought. It would just be fixed.
Right.
That's an interesting one to understand. It's just to be aware. The practice is simply to investigate for yourself, to contemplate. And again, we'll go into more detail on that. So what is not self? How do we recognize the Sanskrit term is anatta? This means that all things and phenomena are without a self nature, that they have no independent existence of their own. When referring to our own personal existence or to others, the Buddha taught that there is no unchanging, permanent existing self that inhibits our bodies. The same is true for everyone else. In other words, we do not have a fixed absolute identity. The experience of I continuing through life as a separate singular being is an illusion, he said. What we call self is a construct of physical, mental, and sensory processes that are interdependent and constantly in flux. Nothing can exist by itself alone. Well, now, what do we mean by that? If you think about who you were at 10 years old, though there might be some continuum, you're not that in that same body. You don't have the same experiences. Things keep changing. Your ideas change. You may notice particularly painful sometimes. Well, say you're in your 20s, 25, you got your college degree and you go home and you're with your parents and they talk about stuff when you were 10 years old and 12 years old, and they complain, why did you do that when you were
Hmm.
12?
Of
And we're like,
course.
my God, I'm not 12 anymore. And so we see that descriptor with others, and when they apply it to us, but oftentimes we think, yeah, I'm the same person. Well, again, the practice is to look into that. We also create in this with things. We have ideas of how things are, and how things should be. Like our job, we create expectations that, my job's always going to be there. Well, things change. They move, and it's through our expectations that things should be exactly one way. But because so many other people are involved in the fluidity of life, then we might create our own suffering because we have an expectation of things to be a particular way, but they didn't turn out that way. And then we're like, oh, well, gosh, if it had been that way, okay, then we look at that. What
Hmm.
created our discontent? It was our illusory expectations.
Right.
So we live in this delusion of our own making until we realize that. So how do we practice not self? Or another term that you'll hear, particularly in Chan, that Sam and I talk about, and it's a new agey term, even though it's 1,000 years old, is emptiness. Our interdependence, our Thich Nhat Hanh would call interbeing.
Mm,
These are all basically the same idea.
that's right.
Again, think about the makeup of a thing. As a simple example, and often picked up by a lot of early teachings, is we look at ourselves and say, this is Dwayne. Well, is this my finger me? Is my hand me? My arm? And you go throughout the body and identify where I exist. Well, we're the we're the many moving parts of many, many things.
Right.
There's no place in my body that I can find me. There's no place in your body that I could find you or you could find yourself. And the same goes for our mental constructs. I know what I know. I know what I learned. I know my experiences. I know my knowledge, and therefore I have this an opinion. And then suddenly someone gives you new information, or you come across new information, vacating everything that you already knew, possibly completely changing it, possibly adding more. But the idea was that it changed. It wasn't as solid as you thought it to be. So your opinions, your concepts, your beliefs are made up of all of these other things. It wasn't a separate, completely new, unheard of idea or concept. It came from
Yes.
somewhere else. So
Yes, absolutely.
to draw an identity on something that is fluid and ever changing, well, you can create suffering. So when we learn to expand this idea to things out there, so we talked about our own internalization of looking at our own body and our own mind, but we can also practice this when we look at things that are out there, objects, this whole subject object thing. We consider ourselves the subject that is looking at an object. Like you take the computer that's in front of all of us right now. The computer obviously is made up of other parts. There's no one place that's the computer. All of these things operate together to form the screen in front of us, the audio, the video. And yet we tend to solidify one another. I know that person. I know what he's going to do. I know all about that person. And we either apply labels that are positive or apply labels that are negative. But if we can't even locate our own self, through our own body, through our own ideas, our own concepts. How could we presume to judge others so harshly or even so lovingly? We're reacting to our own concept. So I want to talk about how we practice all of these things.
Great. Excellent.
The practice can actually be done, what I consider in twofold. Now, first, we often use the term practice. Practice is to observe in real time, to notice things in real time. That's practice, essentially. To come into complete awareness and understanding. Now, how do you do that? You'll often hear the word contemplation used in Buddhism, and think, what is contemplation? Does that have to think about something? Well, yeah, essentially it is. So we can use our logical part of the brain and to contemplate, to kind of use this basic philosophy to take apart our ideas, take apart our constructs, and look for the ideas, these ideas like impermanence, that, hey, yeah, that thing is always changing. And so problems of today will hopefully not be problems a year from now. Surely the problems you had 5 years ago, unless you're in prison, they're gone. You're not having to react to those. Future concerns are not here yet, but you do your planning and you see how the actual flow of life is. So that's one way through change is to look at it. The other is this, and this is a very important part, what we call emptiness. To really look at how we construct ideas, how we piece together and make solid things that are not solid, how we give existence to something that is fluid and ever-changing. That is one of our examples of contemplation. And again, we'll talk hugely in depth about these, but remember that these will always be embedded.
Yes.
And next is the deep dive of meditation, which is really one of the purposes of a secondary, the primary purpose of this channel is meditation, but it's built on this groundwork of understanding some basic doctrine. I call it basic, not because it's not important, because it's the base that builds our entire tower.
Exactly.
The entire tree. It's the ground of which we stand on. Understanding impermanence, understanding emptiness, our not self, and how those either create suffering, discontent, or how, because we recognize this, we break ourselves from our own self-constructed chains. And this is where meditation comes in. How could we possibly recognize this philosophy? Because at this point, it's a philosophy. Well, meditation, from as I was taught, and found to be very effective in changing my life. The purpose of meditation is to develop focus and awareness. We will often talk about single-pointed focus. Why? Why would you want to focus? Are you just trying to ignore the rest of the world? No, you're actually trying to become more aware of it through a single-pointed focus. In most cases, it'll be the breath, but in future, we'll talk about some more so-called advanced techniques. But a single point of focus is to draw the mind to a single point. And then when we notice that we have arbitrary thoughts that come in, that we learn to come back to the single point. Because we know, or hopefully we'll recognize in meditation, that when the mind trails away on a thought can become a sentence become a paragraph, and soon, while we're sitting there quietly, we have a whole story running through our head. And the meditation teacher doesn't even know it because we're sitting there quietly and we look pretty in our stance, yet our mind is 1,000 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we do day to day in all of our interactions with everyone. We're having conversations. We're who knows? We're eating, we're doing, but yet we're watching television or the craziest things that we do. And we all do this every day is we get in our car, we're eating something, we're checking our email, we're listening to music, and we're driving a car.
Hmm. All at
And
the
how
same time.
all at the same time, and then we wonder, well, where'd that car come from? Well, you ran into it actually, probably, or they were just as distracted as you. So that again, it's a term we'll use often, very often. It's distracted thinking, because this distracted thinking is where we don't recognize
Mhm.
impermanence, where we don't recognize emptiness, and we don't recognize that we're creating our own suffering. So again, understanding these concepts, and again, we'll go into much more detail about them later. We'll work them in. Um, really kind of wrapping your mind around it in a quiet time. And then when you're sitting in meditation, or we're doing walking meditation, or we're doing some other moving meditation, we'll have a single point. And generally that's in moving, it's like movements and sensations. When you're sitting, it's really the sensation of sitting and paying attention to the movement of breath or the
Mhm.
movement of the body. And so we're drawing it all in to learn to watch the mind as it trails off and to bring it back. So ultimately, meditation is a exercise in discipline of the mind and awareness of the body. So that's I read from some of that and I went off script, which is fine. I'll oftentimes, if I'm doing a Dharma lesson, I will read from a script. But then when Sav and I get into the Q&A, that's just out of my brain and I don't know what I said. So that's the spiel.
Thank you so much for the really wonderful and thorough and accessible description of the three Dharma seals. Dwayne, I might just bounce some things back off of you and underscore some of
Absolutely.
the things that you've said. Starting with, even for experienced meditation practitioners, Dharma practitioners, there can be a receiving of the three Dharma seals. The way that we receive it is almost kind of negative for beginners and advanced practitioners alike. It's like, oh, wait, like things are impermanent, or life is suffering, or there's no me. Like these are really difficult concepts to hear because we're so used to living in this other mode where we think everything's permanent, the world revolves around me, and my happiness is the most important thing. And the way that I get happiness is by incorporating more of the stuff that I like and disassociating myself with the stuff that I don't like.
Mhm.
So I like chocolate ice cream. I don't like vanilla. So just when I have chocolate ice cream, I'm happy. When someone hands me vanilla ice cream, I'm not happy, right? And
Right.
even though if I eat too much chocolate ice cream, I might, throw up because too much is not good for you. So when we talk about suffering, it's not a negative thing actually to say that the one of the marks of existence is suffering. It's actually the deeper connotation of that is that life is happiness, that life
Yes.
exists, like we exist in joy, we exist in freedom in every moment, and yet the way in which we behave brings us suffering because we're not aligning ourselves with the way things actually are.
Right.
If we were to align ourselves with impermanence, for example, that's not to say that like we should just set fire to everything and live off in the woods and not participate in society because everything's changing all the time. Actually, it's just a recognition that our lives are in constant flux and that nothing in our mind has to stick. That if we were, as one of the examples you gave, if I had an emotion, let's say 5 years ago, I felt shamed by something or I said something that was embarrassing. Why don't I feel that way now? It doesn't, even if I think about it, maybe I get some sort of small emotion about it, but I'm not so concerned. I'm not so invested in that feeling that I was 5 years ago. What does that tell me? Actually, that our feelings, our emotions, our identities are malleable. And we can, if we accept that, we can use that to our advantage to say, somebody just cut me off on the freeway. There's really no reason to be mad about it because I'm still driving and also this emotion of, that initial irritation will evaporate by itself. There's really nothing to hold on to, and that's actually a really beautiful thing. And with not self, that can be also a scary one where we think, well, wait a second, what are you saying? Like there's no me, or there's no Psalm, there's no Dwayne. Actually, what that means more significantly is there's no Psalm or no Dwayne without being in relationship with everything that's around them. That
Exactly.
each of us, we are distinct selves. Like I'm clearly not Dwayne, and you're clearly not Psalm, or we're not other people, but we exist independence on everything that makes us up and everything that is around us. And this is a really helpful experiment that I heard once, and I love to offer to my students, is thinking about yourself or describing yourself without mentioning your relationship to anyone else or anything else. Like if you say, okay, well, I'm a student. Okay, you're a student because you're a teacher, because you have a teacher. There's a teacher that makes you a student. Okay, well, I'm a sibling. I'm the brother or sister of someone or sibling of someone. Okay, well, you're a sibling because you have a sibling that makes you a sibling. You say I'm a mechanic or a scientist. Okay, you're a scientist because you have things that you work on and you work with other people on science, which is not something that you created. You keep peeling back the onion, and we find that actually there's no way in which we can define ourselves that doesn't involve relationship with others. And oftentimes we come back to this one point. We say, okay, well, I'm me. I just know that's who I am. I'm me. And that's the point we have to investigate. That's the place where we say, okay, what is that feeling of me-ness that drives everything that I do, that sees myself at the center of the universe? And I love the way you brought it back, because all of these things uh, are tied together conceptually by the nature of existence, nature of reality, but we really don't begin to understand them unless we have a method. Otherwise, they're just words in the clouds, or just concepts that we understand on the page or academically. We need a method, and
Right.
that's where meditation comes in. And there's so many different styles of meditation. We'll talk about specific methods later on in subsequent episodes. And that meditation, similar to the sort of more positive way that we're looking at the three Dharma seals, is not an exclusion of, it's an invitation in. It's the single pointed concentration is not like I'm just focusing on my breath or focusing on an object or my experience of sitting, whatever the method is, and excluding everything else. Actually, it's being open to everything that is around us, within us, between us, without with as little filters as possible. So we actually experience impermanence. We
Right.
experience not self. We experience the liberation that comes um, free of suffering. And not to belabor the point, but I think it's important also just to see with this concept of emptiness or not self, s- describing our existence actually in relationship to one another. It's not a nihilist thing. It's not like, okay, there's no me, so I should be sad about that. Actually, no, it's everyone and everything is my friend. What arises out of it is compassion. It's that, oh, wow. Yeah, like somebody somebody made uh, s- um, tilled the soil and, uprooted the vegetables that are now on my plate that my spouse cooked for me. Maybe I bought the vegetables, but they don't exist simply because of the currency that I hold in my hand. It took a whole project to develop the meal that sits in front of me, and I'm part of that project, and now I'm ingesting it. What a beautiful thing. What an
Ex-
incredible thing to participate with all of the people and all of the animals and the, you know, bacteria and everything that created these vegetables. And so I'm really just really inspired by what you've said, and it really resonates that to fully understand these concepts, one has to have a method and then bring it into their daily practice so that you can experience it for yourself.
Exactly. And it, you can look at suffering as being the result of getting fixed and wanting things to be permanent. You can see how suffering exists when we disregard the interconnectedness, the interbeing of other things. Particularly on, I guess I'll give two examples of how do you turn that around to where it's just a beautiful, awe-inspiring thing. And one of the things I thought of, and I'd given examples of how, if we go home and our parents treat us like we're still 12, look at our own children. Sam, you have a young one. I have three that are grown. And it's just marvelous to see them grow up and never put that label on them, fix them in that idea of who they were when they were 14, which is almost
Absolutely.
always awful. But to see them return as that mature person they were at, 10 and 12, in their 20s, and it's just amazing. And if we can put that to other people to see this change in other people and other things, to see this marvelous flow, that's liberation. That's the
Absolutely.
opposite of suffering. We're liberated by noticing these wonderful changes. You take the changes in the seasons. You notice Sam's background is a beach scene, and my background is the mountains. I travel between the two based on the seasons. It's miraculous to be on the beach in January, but it's not miraculous to be in the mountains in January. I don't like cold. But so to appreciate those changes is really good. The other thing too is on how we identify ourselves as, I'm the father or the mother or whatever. I'm the sole breadwinner or whatever. And I got to do this job, um, and based on how you're paid and your bills and your life gets so intense, and we live in that intensity, and we identify. Oftentimes this is kind of I'll say this is a trick of capitalism in a way, is that we identify ourselves by the job that we have, the degree that we have, the leadership role that we have, and we tie so much into that, and it becomes part of who we are or who we think we are, and we identify by this role, and our lives can be quite stressful, because if things begin to unhinge from that, oh, okay, maybe your promotion's in question because this other person in this other city is going to come and take your job or something like that. Oh God, who am I without my job? Who am I without my name? Who am I without my credentials? Because we think that's who we are. When you begin to realize that those are the things that you do, those are roles that you do, that is not who you are. Because we all very well know, particularly I'll talk about the job since I use that as an example, that the day that you quit or get fired or die, you're replaced within probably 24 hours, probably replaced before you even get to the parking lot. And so here you made all of this huge deal out of something, and then boom, the world replaced you, meaning all of your identity didn't mean anything to them. So why are we making such a big deal? Yes, you have to do your job. Yes, you have to perform. But without all this angst, without all this heavy burden that we place upon ourselves, that's just an example of how liberating that can be.
Yes.
To recognize this in a very, very real way and go, oh my God, why did I spend all of this time convincing myself who I was? And I know it's a fallacy. I know it's an illusion, just in reality, simply because if you were to leave, you'd be replaced. And so you have no importance at that point. It's only self-created. In reality, it doesn't matter for the person that replaces you, or the fact that you retired. The life goes on, things change, and even companies. How many people have, for years struggled to put in a retirement fund only to have that company closed and you got zilch. And yet we had expectations, we had ideas, we had concepts, and we tied our entire being into that only for it to go away. Still have to plan, still have to think about things, still have to perform, but we don't need it with all the burden on this. So that's the liberation part. That's the beginning of liberation.
That itself is so liberating, just not putting ourselves in a sort of pigeonhole and saying, I've always done this, I've always done it this way, or I always experience this emotion or trigger when I see a specific person or I go home and see my family. Just not having to do that is itself liberating. And I really like something that you said or alluded to, that it's actually a disservice when we put other people into a box and we
Yes.
see them as static entities and we say that they can't change. And that's why we get surprised, because we think generationally, oh, this person is of an older generation or younger generation. And so they're going to act XYZ way. And when they surprise us, it's kind of like something out of the norm, but we're the ones creating that norm. We're the ones who are saying that the person that looks this way or acts this way, or someone that I've known for a long time, they cannot change. They're stuck in this mold and they're not able to move out of it. That's a disservice to that person. When we're open to the idea of impermanence or not self, we start to realize how we actually create our own suffering. We create the image of ourselves as this, as a worker that doesn't deserve happiness, or
Right.
as a person that can't change. And if we're able to shift that perspective of ourselves to something a bit more malleable, a bit more aligned with the way things actually are, that we're not static, that can bring a lot of joy, just even just by thinking that way, without having to go deep into like some meditative state.
Exactly. And I just wanted to give an example of a term that's rather funny to me.
Please.
uh, is how we talk about this generation or that generation. I challenge you to read novels that were written in, say, 300 BC
Hmm.
or 300 AD. And you know what they'll say? Oh, well, this generation is that way and that generation is that way. And it's laughable because
Like a snake eating its own tail, right? It just
because
keeps
if we
going.
talk about people in 300 AD, we talk about people in 300 AD as if they were all the same. And yet we get a label and then we satisfy ourselves by a label of a generation, and saying that generation is that way. And so we're all homogenized because we grew up at a certain period of time. And then when you see the same argument written in a book that was written in, the 12th century, and you go like, well, that's kind of silly of
Isn't that
me
interesting?
categorically put someone that way. And we live in these categories and they are binding. Open up, look a little closer. And that's what this practice is all about. And the meditation is all about, is beginning to see how we construct our own reality through our own thought process based on our own experience and our own knowledge. These things are important when they're important. You use these things when you use these things. But if we embed this into everything that we do, we are limited. Take, for instance, that beach scene behind Song. My wife and I love to walk along the beach and just, look at the sand. I mean, if you want to see impermanence in action, it is artistry to
Oh,
see the
yeah,
waves come in and they just change the face of the sand. It is absolutely never the same.
that's right.
Now,
That's
if
awesome.
you don't notice stuff like that, you go, oh, it's the beach, is the beach. I've been to that beach before. Let me go to another beach. I've seen that beach before. No, you haven't. The old parable, you could never step in the same river twice.
Right. It's so true.
Use stuff like that to disentangle your descriptive analysis of yourself, the world, other people, and you will see so much more. And so this is what this journey that we're on together will be about.
Now I'm going to put you on the spot again, like we did in the previous
Okay.
episode, because I think, and I actually like putting us in this container like this and asking this question because there might be, people out there who have experience with three Dharma seals or meditation, different meditation styles, and there might be people out there who are hearing it for the first time. What would you say to a room full of those people or any one of them about how, like, one simple practice they might bring into their lives just to try this out, try this on for size? What's one daily, thing that they can do? Is it from like, sitting and watching the ocean waves or listening to raindrops on leaves or even just sitting with their breath and seeing things change around them? Or people watching, seeing things change in a cityscape. Like what would be one thing you would recommend that they try doing?
Well, for advanced people, people that have been kind of sitting in meditation and gaining some experience. One thing that Guagu, my teachers, always ask me is, did the mind move? In
Beautiful.
other words, um, the mind movement means is when you're observing something or interacting something, did the mind move with your baggage, with your understanding, with your knowledge, with your experience? Was it filtered? Was mind movement through filter? Because when we talk about mind in this point, we're not talking about the operation of the brain. The mind in this point, at this descriptor, is our baggage, our history, our experiences. Did your experience flow with that huge bag of stuff? So for advanced people that have been doing this for 6 months or a year, mind movement, look at that. If this is kind of new to you, then as you're sitting in meditation or you're watching the waves on the beach, and you're trying to just say, watch the waves on the beach coming in and out. Notice when you kind of zoned out, or you kind of started thinking about something else, or you looked around for something that was a little bit more exciting. Look at that tendency to add to the experience of seeing by wanting to describe it, by wanting to look somewhere else, and then but don't be distracted by that or disturbed by this. Like, God, I just can't concentrate. I keep thinking about other things. Okay, fantastic. You noticed that.
Hmm.
You noticed that you moved away. Your focus was on, we talk about purpose of meditation is to develop focus and awareness. So our focus is watching the waves, just letting the eyes do what they do, maybe hearing them as well. But your focus on just observing, seeing, hearing was moved. Now we can say, oh, dang, I didn't do that right. Or you can say, wow, this is an indicator of how programmed I am, how conditioned I am to travel off. So if I'm conditioned to do that, and I think when I'm having a conversation with my teenager, I'm really being active listening. Probably not. You probably have all of their history, your interpretation of their history, your own personal opinions, and all of that interlaid, and you are not actually hearing them at all. You're hearing your filtered sense of the conversation, and you're not fully present. And saying, "Oh gosh!" So even when you notice that at that point, you just go back and say, dang, this is really deep. The tentacles of self, the tentacles of identity are there. Oh my God, this is real. This is how I create conflict. And the more I keep bringing this stuff in, I mean, when it's necessary, it's necessary. But probably a good portion of the time, it's not necessary. You have to know how to drive a car. You can't forget, but you can't drive a truck and wish you were in a Porsche. You're in a truck, so you drive your truck. So two different ways is the just the single the more refined thing. Did the mind move at all? For advanced folks. For new folks, it's kind of just watching that you did get distracted and coming back, and you're kind of adding a almost a sense of awe or fascination or curiosity. And curiosity is something we'll often talk about, and fascination is this curiosity of just how deep this goes, our identity, our opinions, how deep it goes and how threaded it is into our mental continuum. So that's what I would suggest.
Awesome. Yeah, and what I love about that, even though I know I asked you to come up with this on the spot, it's such a beautifully worded set of exercises because one necessarily leads to the other.
Yes,
That for more advanced practitioners, knowing when the mind moves, that presupposes that one knows what their resting state of their mind is.
right.
And the first practice actually takes us there because we start to notice most of us are, being led around by the nose by our emotions and our feelings and our triggers without having any knowledge that any of that is going on. And the first step
Exactly.
is just to start to realize that, recognize it, acknowledge it, and then we can get deeper into our practice. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Of course.
Anything else to share about the three Dharma seals today?
I don't think so, because otherwise this will be a 4 hour Zoom.
That's right.
So we have to take this in little pieces. It's really important to take it into pieces too. Don't try to read all this stuff. And as I was first practicing with Guagu, I would go back, and this is really the purpose of one of these channels, is to go back and listen to what was said, because as soon as you think you've got it, you have solidified it. And just based on what we just said, to solidify something is to not fully understand it, to not fully appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And so you go back over and over again. So we'll give bite-sized chunks, and we'll even take smaller chunks out of this. But you know, just stick with it. Be on this journey with us, and we'll do this together, all of us.
Sounds awesome. And let me just thank you again for joining us for episode 2 of Off the Cushion podcast. We really appreciate having you here. And if you have any questions or comments, please do leave them in the comment section. We'll try to get back to you. Be sure to like and subscribe for more, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Bye, everyone.